let's talk about Sheffield, because there's been a tree debacle there, and that at first sound doesn't sound that extraordinary, but let's talk about it. Why we need an inquiry into the Sheffield street tree debacle. So there's been an article done by Now Then, an excellent partner of this show, who do a whole range of stuff from arts, culture, investigations, news, and all sorts of stuff. And they're brilliant in so many different ways. Really do check them out. But let's talk about what occurred with the street tree debacle. Julie Dore is resigning as leader of the council. Her recent unreserved apology is not enough. Her successor should immediately launch a public inquiry into the felling of thousands of our city's trees. Russell Johnson from Sheffield Tree Action Groups, STAG, good acronym, like it, has called on the council to pay the costs incurred by campaigners who have found to have broken the injunction. This was an injunction that was designed to stop people from physically protecting street trees, many which we now know should have never been targeted for felling in the first place. The article then lists 5 reasons why this compensation should be paid, outlining council dishonesty to the courts in 2 significant ways: the illegality of the felling itself, so it was illegal to fell a lot of these trees, the council misleading the public, and huge sums of cash being wasted on private security, bouncers, police, and court cases. And that is, you know, as we were talking about, like the problems with councils before, they can deliver services far better than extraordinarily corrupt multinational corporations who fleece governments left, right, and centre. But as we can see in this case, maybe they're not whiter than white or cleaner than clean. So, as the article states, if Sheffield Council is genuinely sorry, reimbursement of these costs should give some credibility to that apology. Now, I want to bring in Sam Walby here from Now Then and ask him about the details of this. Sam, sorry for bringing you so late. It's been a banger, but this has
been brilliant.
Yeah. Ultimately, didn't the trees need to go? Like, it says some of the trees were illegally felled, but didn't the roads need to be fixed in Sheffield? I've been to Sheffield. The roads are terrible. Isn't this just kind of NIMBYism?
So Sheffield is one of the greenest cities in Europe. So we've got 37,000 street trees. So that's just on streets, not including the Peak District, where there's hundreds of thousands of trees. Now, some of those genuinely did need to go. But in the end, about 5,500 of them were cut down before the council really recognised that it needed to change its approach and listen more to people. It could well be the case. Sadly, we just can't say for sure because of the commercial sensitivity, in quote marks, around the PFI contract with Amy, which is the infrastructure company who's doing this work. It could well be the case that many of those older trees that were replaced with younger trees, that was only done because it would save money on maintenance for that company during the lifespan of that PFI contract. And that's the main argument for a lot of these campaigners in Sheffield, which is that even though these trees were felled and replaced like for like with young trees, was there a commercial imperative to replace those trees that really didn't need replacing just to save money for a multinational corporation? Yes, you're right. The roads in Sheffield were awful, and it became a bit of a running joke, like a lot of cities in the north. Personally, I'm far more in favour of developing infrastructure for cycling and walking, but obviously potholes are dangerous for cyclists, arguably most. But, you know, this is a rock and a hard place for the council, and certainly when they opened this contract in 2012, it was signed, there wasn't a lot of money flying around, funnily enough. So, you know, a real rock and a hard place for them. And just on your point about NIMBYism, I mean, you're starting to sound quite a lot like the council, actually. You know, that's what they said, and this is where it got them into a real tangle, you know, because, you know, ultimately not in my backyard, that seems like a pretty valid excuse of a response for local people, you know, for a campaign of what is effectively environmental vandalism. You know, and the council say that Amy never had targets for felling within that contract. So they didn't have a certain number of trees they had to fell. So not in my backyard doesn't really apply here because it's not like they would have gone to another neighbourhood instead and just arbitrarily cut down a load of trees there. Or maybe they would, I don't know.
So, well, I guess that kind of semi-answers my next question, which is what would an inquiry really tell us? Because surely the damage has been done now.
Yeah, I mean, quite a lot of the damage has been done. I think there's a lot of trust been lost in this administration, which they'll never get back. I'm not here to advocate directly for an inquiry. Obviously, our writer is really passionate about that. I think the most recent, the proper Hillsborough inquiry that was long overdue, I think that cost South Yorkshire Police alone, it cost them about £22 million. They're not cheap, obviously. We've also never had a proper inquiry into the Battle of Orgreave, which I probably would prioritise over this as well, personally, which was rejected by Amber Rudd as Home Secretary 3 or 4 years ago. But what might we find if there was an inquiry? Well, we know that the council misled public in Sheffield on a number of issues related to trees. We don't really know the extent of that and how consciously they did that. We don't know how many trees were felled illegally, and actually because of poor record keeping within council, we might never know that. They made an argument that they were felling these trees under their obligation to highways legislation. That was shown to be false. They purposefully started cutting trees down at 5 o'clock in the morning on one street because they knew that residents were so opposed. So they were banging on doors at 5 a.m. saying, come and move your car, we're chopping these trees down. So I guess to answer your question, potentially we could be looking at misuse of public funds and misconduct in public office. What an inquiry wouldn't tell us because of this, and I'd like to come back to this commercial sensitivity point, is we're probably never going to know whether there was a commercial imperative to cut those trees down, because that's sealed in a contract between the council and Amy, which we will probably never see. So there was a heavily redacted version of that contract released, but we're probably never going to see the full version. We're probably never going to know if there were really targets for how many trees should be cut down and whether those targets were kept secret. Basically, anything in depth about that contract, we will probably never know.
Right. Yeah, because this leads to another question I was going to ask, which is, I mean, I was going to ask, like, how is this important in the national context? But, specifically this commercial, this has been utilised. I've spoken to journalists who've come up against this, where it's you can hide a lot of things under this clause. Does this tell us anything about PFI or local government that could be useful for others in the national context?
Well, yeah, definitely. I mean, on the left, we tend to be allergic to PFIs, don't we? It's like a rude word. It's like a swear word. And I think often that the focus of that is on the ideological aspect, which I personally am on board with, which is, this is work we should be financing through public bodies. We should have full oversight and understanding and not siphoning it off to the private sector. But for me, the key thing here is that we're not allowed to know so many key details about a contract which we, effectively the people, have made with this company. This heavily redacted contract, which was released after months and months of pushing through freedom of information and various other channels. There's a suggestion that the current leader of Sheffield City Council hasn't even read the contract. And I know that anybody who has seen the contract has had to sign an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement. I don't know whether the leader of Sheffield Council didn't want to see the contract because she didn't want to actually know what was in it, or whether she wasn't allowed to see it. Obviously we can kick out Sheffield City Council, and there's a good chance that the constitution of the council is going to change a lot in May anyway. But we can't kick out this private company until 2037. And their plan was, let's do all the work in 5 years and then we'll be making a profit for 20 years. I mean, that's backfired because of the actions of a lot of campaigners here. But I think to come back to the question in the national context, it does show us the really desperate situation that councils are in funding wise due to austerity, but obviously due to 30, 40 years of cuts, which are all, in my opinion, related to sapping away their power and what they can actually do and the kind of wiggle room that they have. But I think that's led to a culture within a lot of local authorities where transparency and honesty and all this sort of stuff, they're not being respected. But these councils don't have the expertise, they don't have the money, they don't have the time anymore to really take a stand on these things. So this is an example of the council trying to just sort of push it to one side, and it really, really, really backfired on them. But I mean, again, to me, the biggest issue here is we're not allowed to know what's in that contract, and that secrecy, which is driven by commercial interest, undoubtedly, is really, really damaging to trust and local democracy, and it encourages distrust, it encourages paranoia, it puts everybody's backs up, and it makes people feel like they're just being completely ignored and that no one cares what they think.
Yeah, and this is the concern. And again, like, earlier when we were talking to Claire, there's already a distrust of local government, which is a problem in this pandemic, right? I mean, this report, to me, this news article raises a question about local democracy and citizens being able to shape their own environment. How, what can we do about this? How best can we see it? Because especially, I think we have a right when we talk about shaping our own environment, not just the health of the environment. Trees do a lot for health and air quality, but also what we look at, food for the soul through the eyes. Like we need this. So what do you think we can do about this, and what can we learn from these reports, from these pieces?
Well, I think we just desperately need new and genuinely meaningful ways of local people being able to engage with those decision-making processes. Councils and various other bodies are legally obliged to do consultations on certain things, but very often that's a box-ticking exercise. Very often it's an anonymous letter that comes through the post and will get ignored in most cases. They did one survey on opinions to Sheffield street trees, and I think the response rate was about 12%. Because it dropped through in a completely anonymous sort of envelope. And so it's kind of gone out of fashion, like I say, particularly in Sheffield. And I think it's down to lack of resource and bandwidth and ability to actually think about this, but genuinely listening to what people think and trying to feed that in and showing them that is part of an ongoing decision-making process. I mean, if the council had nipped this in the bud early and got around the table, which they did end up doing with campaigners, this whole thing could have been avoided, and they probably would have saved money as well. And I think that their original motivation was, this is going to cost us because, and I'm speculating here, but there are probably various clauses in that contract that could have cost the council loads of money if milestones aren't hit. Now, they've obviously pushed forward with this and tried to brute force it through concerns about that. But they've actually probably ended up costing themselves and Amy, entertainingly, more money in the process, because they couldn't just get around the table and say, we understand where you're coming from, you care about your trees, which are in some cases 80 or 100 years old. It's all well and good saying you're going to replace trees like for like, but replacing a tree that's 30 foot tall with a tree that's 4 foot tall, that's a huge change in the street scene. And so I think there were a lot of ways of dismissing those campaigners. One of them was, they're just middle class people, and then the other one was around the political aspect. Well, these are just our political opponents of the Labour administration. What they didn't do is get around the table and say, we think your concerns are valid. What can we do to address this? They did that after 18 months, 2 years. They should have done it straight away. And we need ongoing mechanisms for people to be able to talk to people who are making these decisions.
Yeah, like this crazy tribalism, isn't it? It's like, well, first off, it's a middle class concern to have trees. It's like working class people deserve clean air and trees as well. Like, what happened to, like, how patronizing can you say that, like, us as working class people don't deserve trees in our lives, or don't like them? Well, we just want roads, we just want concrete and brutalism. And secondly, like, it's an idea of like there's a certain tribalism at the local level, maybe within the Labour Party, maybe it happens in Tory councils as well. I don't know. I've never lived in one, where they just assume everyone is an opponent of Labour, and they attacked, I believe, councillors who were Green councillors. I believe in the article it describes how they were driven out. So what we need is ongoing processes where they're actually talking to the people they're supposed to represent at a very local level, because the ways that they seem to do that, these consultation stuff, they've become moribund, haven't they? They're like, they don't seem to work.
No, they don't work at all, and people don't see themselves in it. They don't see why it's important. They're not. All those decision-making processes are so opaque. I bet 98% of people in Sheffield don't realise that you can watch most council meetings through live video. And actually catch-up video as well. I bet most people don't know that, even though they've spent hundreds of thousands of pounds to make that so, and that's the right thing to do. But the communication isn't there to say, here's why it's important that you engage with what is being decided in this room. And this is just one example of hundreds that you could come up with. Sheffield's got a race equality commission happening at the moment, and they're looking at 6 different areas of how racial inequality affects people's experiences living in Sheffield. And that's a really positive example of the council doing something proactive and saying, yeah, we're getting out in front of this because it's important. And we need more of that, but we also need these constant channels for citizens to actually feed in and say this is a problem, and rather than those concerns just being dismissed as middle-class people who've got nothing better to do, or political opponents who are trying to assassinate the administration.
Yeah. Well, what I can suggest to viewers to do about this is, one, get on your council live stream. A lot of them do them nowadays. But secondly, read Now Then, check them out. Check out Opus Independence and all the great work they do, including Festival of Debate. Sam, I'm going to tie it up here unless there's any final thoughts from you. You feel like
that's it. Thanks for having me. I've said my piece.
Yeah, wonderful. It's grand.